Hello, I'm continuing my reviews on George A. Romero's Living Dead series with Land of the Dead. Now, Land of the Dead came out in 2005, and the film, of course, is written and directed by George A. Romero, and this is the fourth film in George A. Romero's Living Dead series, which started in 1968 with the film Night of the Living Dead. Now, I don't think anybody can deny that Night of the Living Dead is a classic, and it's one of those movies that even if you don't like the movie, you gotta respect the movie though, because really, if it wasn't for Night of the Living Dead, we wouldn't have stuff like The Walking Dead or World War Z or Resident Evil. Like, the modern day zombie film came from Night of the Living Dead. Now, Night of the Living Dead was not the first zombie film, but it was the first zombie film to use the premise that if you get bitten by a zombie, you become a zombie. It was essentially the first plague zombie film, and it was also the first zombie apocalypse film. Like, the zombie apocalypse genre came from Night of the Living Dead. And in 1978, George A. Romero would follow Night of the Living Dead up with Dawn of the Dead, which I actually do consider to be better than Night of the Living Dead. And in 1985, he would follow it up with Day of the Dead, which at the time that movie came out, it was pretty much considered to be the black sheep of the Night of the Living Dead franchise, but now a lot of George A. Romero fans, myself included, consider Day of the Dead to be the strongest film of George A. Romero's Dead series. Now, for me, and I'm sure a lot of other horror fans would agree with this, but to me, I actually consider the first three films of George Romero's Night of the Living Dead series, Night of the Living Dead, Dawn of the Dead, and Day of the Dead, that is pretty much like the Star Wars trilogy for horror fans. So, I think it's safe to say that in 2005, when this movie came out, this film had a lot to live up to. Now, I just want to say right off the bat that I actually really do like Land of the Dead. Like, this film is kind of polarizing for a lot of horror fans. Like, some people like it and some people really don't, but I happen to really enjoy Land of the Dead. Now, it's not as good as the first three films in this series, but I would say I think this film actually fits really well with Night of the Living Dead, Dawn of the Dead, and Day of the Dead. Like, it really does, it really is a good addition to the Living Dead franchise. Now, in my opinion, Land of the Dead really is the final film in George Romero's Living Dead series. Like, he did follow this up with Diary of the Dead and Survival of the Dead, but I don't really count those films as being part of this series, and I'll get to why I don't count those films at the end of this review. Now, this movie was actually originally going to be titled Dead Reckoning, and they actually talk about it on my Dawn of the Dead DVD that I have. There's a little bio, like there's a George Romero bio as one of these special features, and in the bio, it says that Romero is trying to write a fourth film in his Living Dead series, and according to the bio, it's going to be called Dead Reckoning. Keep in mind that this bio was written before this movie came out, so on the Dawn of the Dead DVD that I have, according to the little bio, this film was originally going to be called Dead Reckoning. Now, I actually remember when this movie came out, I was 12 going on 13 at the time, and at the time I had already seen the first three films. Like, at the time I was really starting to get into George Romero's stuff, like the Night of the Living Dead movies and the Creepshow movies, so when this movie came out, I actually got to see it in the theaters, and for a young George Romero fan, being able to see a George Romero zombie film in the theaters, that was kind of cool for me because, once again, I was just starting to get into Romero's stuff. Now, the plot of Land of the Dead is it's set years and years after the zombie apocalypse that you saw play out in Night of the Living Dead, Dawn of the Dead, and Day of the Dead, but now society has kind of rebuilt itself, but not really. It turns out that the survivors of the zombie apocalypse have now set up outposts all over the United States, and the movie takes place in one particular outpost in what used to be Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. And this outpost is surrounded by walls and electric fences to keep the zombies out, but basically the rich and powerful get to live in this high-rise apartment building called Fiddler's Green, while everybody else pretty much lives in the slums. And this small little piece of what used to be Pittsburgh is rolled over by this corrupt politician named Kaufman, who's played by Dennis Hopper in the movie, and he's pretty much the main villain of the movie. And what happens is, because there's such a divide in this city between the rich and the poor, there's the potential for an all-out class war breaking out, and at the same time, the zombies are starting to become much more intelligent, and this proves later on in the film to not be a good thing at all. Now, in the movie, there's a character named Cholo, I hope I'm saying his name right, who's played by John Leguizamo in the movie, and he works for Kaufman, and he does Kaufman's dirty work, and as the movie goes on, you come to realize what that dirty work actually is, but he feels kind of screwed over by Kaufman, and what happens in the movie is him and a few other people end up stealing this huge military vehicle that's built for killing the zombies called Dead Reckoning, which has like all these missiles and guns, and he's now threatening to blow up Fiddler's Green if Kaufman doesn't give him what he feels Kaufman owes him. So in the movie, Kaufman ends up going to this guy named Riley, who is the main protagonist of the movie, and he's the one who designed Dead Reckoning, and now Kaufman needs him to go out and get Dead Reckoning back. Now, Riley doesn't really like Kaufman, but he realizes that if Cholo does what he's threatening to do, a lot of innocent people will end up getting killed. So in the movie, Riley and this woman named Slack and his friend Charlie and a few other characters go out to try to stop Cholo. Now, the character of Riley, who's played by Simon Baker, he's actually a really likable character, and his friend Charlie is also a really likable character as well, and a really funny character too, but you also feel sorry for him because part of his face was burnt, and he's also kind of mentally challenged, but Riley is a really awesome character, and so is his friend Charlie. And then you have the character of Slack, who's also a really likable character. Now, she's played by Asia Argento. Now, Asia Argento is, of course, the daughter of famous Italian filmmaker Dario Argento. And she's been in films like Demons 2 and The Church, and she was in The Mother of Tears, and she was also in movies like Triple X and stuff like that. But Asia Argento is a really good actress, and she does do a really good job in this movie. And Tom Savini actually has a cameo appearance in this movie as a zombie with a machete, and it's supposed to be the same character that he played in Dawn of the Dead, who of course died in Dawn of the Dead, so now he's a zombie. There's also a cameo appearance from Simon Pegg and Edgar Wright, who both play zombies in this movie. Now, as I said before, I actually really do like Land of the Dead, and like the first 3 films in this series, this movie also has a lot of social commentary in it. Like, in this movie, there's a lot of commentary on things like the rich versus the poor, because in this city that the movie takes place in, there's this huge divide between the rich and the poor, and once again, now there's the potential for an all-out class war breaking out. So, once again, in the film, there's a lot of commentary on things like class systems and the idea of the rich versus the poor. Now, that's actually one thing that a lot of people did kind of complain about this movie, is in the movie you have characters who are rich, and you have John Leguizamo's character in this movie who wants money from Kaufman, but a lot of people have made the argument that what good is money anymore in a post-apocalyptic world, but I almost feel like that's kind of the point of the movie, that money really isn't good anymore, yet these characters are holding on to the illusion that money is still worth something. And in the movie, you see people trying to live like people did before the zombie apocalypse happened, but once again, like, it seems like the characters in this movie are trying desperately to hold on to the world that once was. Now, you could make the argument that maybe money is still good in these outposts where you get what's left of civilization, but I really do kind of get the idea that money really isn't good anymore, but these characters are once again holding on to this illusion that the world is still somehow like it used to be, even though it's not, and they're holding on to the illusion that money still has some kind of power. Now, in this movie, you could definitely tell that George Romero was trying to make a commentary on the post-9/11 society that we're living in now, and I have heard some critics refer to this film as an indictment of George Bush's anti-terrorism policies. Keep in mind, this movie came out in 2005, so George Bush was still in office at this time, so if you wanted to read the movie that way, I guess you could make that interpretation. But once again, in this movie, there is a lot of political and social commentary, which was definitely relevant at the time this movie came out. But once again, I enjoy Land of the Dead. It's not as good as the first 3 films, but it's still a worthy addition to this series, and once again, I think it fits very well with the first 3 films. Now, in 2007, George A. Romero would direct the film Diary of the Dead, which is considered to be the 5th film in the Living Dead series, but the thing is, though, I don't really count it as being part of the series, because the thing about Night of the Living Dead, Dawn of the Dead, Day of the Dead, and Land of the Dead is, even though there is kind of a timeline issue, I could still easily buy that these 4 films are all taking place in the same cinematic universe, but Diary of the Dead is so clearly set in a different universe than the first 4 films, so I really don't count it as being part of the series. At best, you could call it maybe a reboot of George Romero's Living Dead series, but I personally don't count it as being part of the series, mainly because it so clearly takes place in a different cinematic universe than the first 4 films. Now, I have seen Diary of the Dead, and somewhere down the line I might do a review on it, I'm not sure. It actually isn't a bad movie, but once again, I don't really really count it as being part of the series. Now, I still have not yet seen Survival of the Dead, which I know is a direct sequel to Diary of the Dead, but I've heard a lot of bad things about Survival of the Dead. But once again, I don't really count Diary of the Dead and Survival of the Dead as really being part of the series, so in my opinion, this film really was the final film in the series, and I actually think it's a really good conclusion to the series. So that was my review on Land of the Dead, and this concludes my series of reviews on Romero's Living Dead series. Somewhere down the line, like maybe in a couple of years from now, I might review Diary and Survival, but for now on, once again, this concludes my series of reviews on Romero's Dead films. Now, to give you a hint on what my next movie review is going to be, let's just say the next movie I'm going to review is a very important film in the horror genre, and it's one of the most famous and legendary horror films of all time, and this is going to give you a major hint of what the next movie I'm going to review is. Your mother sucks cocks in hell.